Corporal Jason Lee came home from Afghanistan a hero, celebrated by his community in rural Georgia with a parade and a wedding to plan. But just 1 month later, he was found shot dead in his garage. The police called it a botched break-in, but nothing had been stolen. As the investigation unfolded, dark secrets began to surface, leading detectives to a shocking truth. Jason had been tracking a fellow veteran who wasn't who he claimed to be, and the story of betrayal, stolen valor, and a deadly cover-up would leave the entire town stunned. Corporal Jason Lee came home to Willow Creek as a decorated war hero. His return was everything a small southern town could hope for, flags waving, children cheering, and neighbors lining the streets to welcome him back. It had been nearly 8 years since he first enlisted, and after serving 2 grueling tours in Afghanistan, he was finally coming home for good. Local news covered the parade. Veterans in full uniform stood at attention. His fiancée, Emily Parker, waited at the end of Main Street with tears in her eyes and a ring already picked out. Everything seemed perfect. The town saw him as a symbol of honor and resilience, someone who had given everything for his country and now deserved peace. But beneath the celebration, something about Jason had changed. He smiled politely, shook hands, and said all the right things. But there was a quiet tension in his body, a stiffness that didn't come from physical injury. His eyes scanned every crowd. He flinched at sudden noises. He didn't like sitting with his back to the door, and he checked his rear view mirror more than usual. At first, those around him chalked it up to the adjustment. They said he just needed time to settle in, to get used to being home. After all, combat changed people. That's what everyone told Emily when she began to worry. Jason moved back into his late parents' house, a modest 2-story just outside of town. It sat on a quiet stretch of road, half hidden by trees and overgrown grass. He told Emily he liked the privacy. He said he wanted to fix it up before they got married. But instead of planning renovations or picking out paint colors, Jason spent more time inside with the blinds drawn. Neighbors would see him outside occasionally, usually late at night, checking the locks on his garage or sweeping a flashlight across the backyard. He never said much about what he'd seen overseas. When people asked, he gave short answers, always polite but never detailed. Even Emily, who had written to him every week during deployment, felt like he was keeping a part of himself hidden. Something was bothering him, something he couldn't shake. She noticed him watching the same stretch of road from the front porch, eyes locked on the woods across the street. He told her once that he felt like someone was following him. She brushed it off as anxiety and promised it would pass. But Jason didn't think it would. To the outside world, he was a war hero stepping into a new life. But Jason Lee didn't feel safe. And deep down, he seemed to know that something or someone was coming for him. Jason's death hit Willow Creek like a lightning strike. One moment, the town was celebrating the return of a hometown hero. The next, his face was plastered on every news channel as the victim of a mysterious and violent crime. Early one Friday morning, Emily arrived at Jason's house after he failed to answer her calls or show up for a breakfast date. His truck was in the driveway, and the porch light was still on from the night before. Something felt off immediately. The front door was locked, but when she walked around back, the garage door was half open. Inside, she found Jason lying on the cold concrete floor, blood pooled around him, a single gunshot wound to his chest. Panic turned to confusion. Police arrived quickly and sealed off the house. There were no signs of a struggle, no broken windows, and nothing appeared to be missing. His wallet, phone, and even a brand new laptop were left untouched. The keys to his truck were still on the workbench just a few feet away. Nothing about the scene pointed to a robbery or home invasion, and yet someone had been inside his garage, and someone had killed him. Investigators began with the obvious questions. Did Jason have enemies? Any suspicious relationships? Any known involvement in risky behavior? But the answers all came back clean. By every account, Jason was stable, sober, and cautious. He didn't go out much. He didn't hang with a wild crowd. His most regular outings were grocery store trips and walks through the woods behind his house. What caught the attention of detectives, though, was the absence of anything obvious. The house was too clean, the scene too quiet. No footprints, no fingerprints. Whoever had entered Jason's garage had done so without alerting neighbors or leaving behind evidence. The precision of it made them uneasy. This didn't look like the work of a burglar caught in the act. It looked planned. Word spread fast through Willow Creek. Some people thought maybe Jason had taken his own life, the scars of war finally catching up to him. But that theory was quickly dismissed. The angle of the wound, the lack of gunpowder residue, and the missing weapon all ruled out suicide. This wasn't self-inflicted. This was murder. Emily was devastated, barely able to speak in the days that followed. She clung to Jason's letters, the ones he'd sent from overseas, trying to find any clue that could make sense of what had happened. But there was nothing. Only silence, unanswered questions, and the haunting feeling that Jason had been right. All along, someone had been watching him. As the investigation deepened, detectives began retracing Jason's final days. What they uncovered pointed to something far more complex than a random act of violence. In his bedroom, tucked between stacks of unopened mail and old photographs, police found a small black notebook. It wasn't a journal in the traditional sense. There were no long entries or personal reflections. Instead, it was filled with short, nervous observations. Dates, times, and vague descriptions lined the pages. White truck, 11:47 p.m., parked, across the street again. Felt like someone followed me from the store. Saw movement behind shed. Nothing there when I checked. Each line hinted at a growing fear, a creeping sense that someone was watching him. Emily told detectives that Jason had grown more distant in the weeks before his death. He avoided phone calls. He skipped dinner plans. Once, she said, he arrived at her house 2 hours early, looking pale and shaken. He told her he thought someone was tailing him, that a car had been following him down the back road to his house. But when she asked who it was, he couldn't give a name. He just said it. Didn't feel right. Investigators reviewed footage from nearby businesses, hoping to trace Jason's last known movements. At a gas station on the edge of town, they found something. On 2 separate nights, Jason had stopped for fuel. Both times, a white pickup truck appeared in the background. It didn't have front plates, and the driver's face was obscured by a baseball cap. The truck never pulled in to fill up. It just sat idling near the edge of the parking lot. It wasn't enough to identify anyone, but it confirmed what Jason had feared. He was being followed, and it hadn't been his imagination. The white truck had appeared multiple times in different parts of town, always within minutes of Jason's location. Someone had been tracking him, quietly, carefully, and deliberately. Jason hadn't shared these fears with many people. He told Emily vaguely. He mentioned it to a former fellow soldier in a short message. But he never contacted law enforcement. He never reported a threat. He handled it on his own, keeping notes, watching patterns, trying to understand what he was dealing with. For detectives, this changed everything. Jason's death was no longer just a murder. It looked like the end result of a sustained campaign. Someone had studied him, stalked him, and struck when he was alone. Now, investigators needed to find out who had reason to target a man like Jason Lee, and why they had waited until now to act. Jason's phone became the next focus of the investigation. While it appeared undisturbed at the crime scene, digital forensics revealed something strange. Large portions of his message history had been manually deleted. Texts, call logs, and even saved contacts were missing. This wasn't the result of an automatic cleanup or routine reset. Someone had gone through the phone and wiped specific threads. Whoever did it knew exactly what they didn't want found. Technicians were able to recover fragments of some deleted messages. One recurring contact was listed only as R. There were no photos, no full name, and no recent calls. But several short messages remained partially intact. One read, "I know it's not who you think." Another said, "Just keep your head down, man." The most chilling one came days before Jason's death. "He was never in the unit. I checked. Be careful." This discovery opened a new line of inquiry. Jason hadn't just been feeling watched. He had been actively investigating someone. The mention of the unit suggested he was looking into someone's military background, trying to verify if they had actually served. Emily confirmed that Jason had recently started asking questions about people in town, particularly one man, Ryan Carter. Ryan was a quiet neighbor who had moved into the area less than a year earlier. He claimed to be an Iraq veteran and wore a combat patch on his jacket. Locals often saw him at the Veterans Bar, trading war stories and offering support to newly returned soldiers. Jason had spoken to him once or twice, but Emily remembered Jason saying something didn't add up. He said Ryan's dates of service didn't match what he was claiming, and that some of his stories seemed pulled from movies or online forums. Jason had started digging deeper. Investigators found browser history on his laptop that included military records databases, stolen Valor forms, and online guides for verifying a person's service. It was clear that he suspected Ryan wasn't who he claimed to be. But what Jason didn't realize, or maybe did, was that someone was monitoring him just as closely. The deleted messages suggested that Jason had uncovered a dangerous lie. He was trying to figure out how far it went and who else was involved. But instead of going to the police, he kept it quiet, possibly hoping to confront the person himself or gather enough proof to expose them. Now, with Jason gone and the messages mostly erased, investigators were left piecing together a puzzle, without the one person who knew the whole story. Whatever Jason had discovered had cost him his life. The question now was how deep that secret went, and who else was willing to kill to protect it. Detectives turned their attention to Ryan Carter, the man Jason had grown suspicious of in the weeks before his death. On the surface, Ryan appeared ordinary, quiet, polite, and respectful. He rented a small one-story home 2 doors down from Jason's. He told neighbors he was a former Army sergeant who had served in Iraq and spent time in recovery for PTSD. He participated in local veterans events and even helped organize a fundraiser for wounded soldiers. To most people in Willow Creek, he was just another man trying to rebuild his life. But to Jason, something didn't feel right. Police attempted to contact Ryan for a formal interview, but he didn't answer his phone. When they visited his home, no one came to the door. Over the next 2 days, he failed to show up at work, missed appointments at the VA clinic, and stopped attending his regular visits to the local bar. By day 3, neighbors began reporting that his lights hadn't been on since the night of Jason's murder. His dog, which he used to walk every evening, hadn't been seen either. Officers obtained a warrant and entered the property. Inside, the house was in disarray. Dishes were left in the sink, food had spoiled in the fridge, and clothes were scattered across the floor as if someone had packed in a hurry. In the bedroom closet, they found military uniforms, medals, and framed certificates. But a closer look revealed something disturbing. None of the documents matched. The name, serial number, and unit information varied slightly across each piece. Some used the name Ryan Carter, others had entirely different aliases. In a locked drawer of his desk, detectives found forged discharge papers, printed emails referencing veteran benefits, and a notepad with Jason Lee's name written at the top. Jason's address and phone number were scribbled beneath it. Alongside that, there were several photos printed from social media. Jason walking with Emily, Jason at the Veterans Bar, and Jason attending the parade in his honor. The most alarming discovery was a hand-drawn map of the neighborhood with red markings on Jason's house. It detailed the layout of his backyard, the location of his garage entrance, and even what time he typically left for errands. Ryan hadn't just lied about his past. He had been watching Jason, tracking him. Whatever Jason had suspected, he had been right. Someone was pretending to be a soldier, and that person was now missing. As police launched a manhunt for Ryan Carter, they realized the truth might be even more twisted than they first imagined. Jason's death wasn't random. It was part of something calculated and deeply personal. The deeper investigators looked into Ryan Carter, the clearer it became that he was not who he claimed to be. His real name was Derrick Miles, a 39-year-old drifter with a long history of fraud, identity theft, and impersonation. He had bounced between states for years, using forged documents to pose as a veteran law enforcement officer and even a paramedic. In each case, he stayed just long enough to gain trust and access benefits before vanishing without a trace. Willow Creek had simply been his next target until he crossed paths with Jason Lee. The timeline of Derrick's arrival now took on a new, sinister meaning. He had moved into the neighborhood roughly 8 months before Jason returned from deployment. Almost immediately, he inserted himself into the local veteran community. He volunteered at events, visited the VA clinic regularly, and even gave an emotional speech at a Memorial Day service. But none of his credentials were real. His service record was fabricated. His uniform, medals, and ID badges were all forgeries, crafted with precision. Detectives discovered that Derrick had used a combination of real and stolen information to build his persona. Some details came from actual soldiers whose identities he had copied online. Others were entirely made up. He had applied for veteran housing assistance, claimed PTSD benefits, and secured a job at a nearby security company, all under false pretenses. Jason, with his sharp instincts and first-hand military experience, had noticed things others missed. The inconsistencies in Derrick's stories weren't obvious to civilians, but to someone who had truly served, they stood out like red flags. It was likely that Jason had begun verifying Derrick's claims through unofficial channels, contacts from his old unit, military databases, and support networks. What he found must have alarmed him. The messages recovered from Jason's phone and laptop showed that he had started compiling proof, documents, screenshots, and handwritten notes. He had even made a list of questions he planned to ask Derrick directly, but it seemed he never got the chance. Investigators now believed Jason had confronted Derrick or made it clear that he was on to him. That moment likely triggered Derrick's decision to disappear and eliminate the threat Jason posed. Jason wasn't just exposing a fraud. He was unraveling a carefully built identity that Derrick had used for years to manipulate and deceive. Derrick Miles had every reason to protect his secret, and Jason Lee, a real soldier who had seen through the lies, stood in the way. In Derrick's twisted mind, silencing Jason was the only way to keep the truth buried. As the search for Derrick Miles intensified, detectives uncovered an alarming pattern in his past. This wasn't the first time he had pretended to be a soldier. Far from it. Records and reports from across multiple states showed that Derrick had been operating under various aliases for nearly a decade. Each time, his method was the same. He would embed himself into a community, create a detailed military backstory, and use it to gain trust, sympathy, and access to resources meant for real veterans. He was a career imposter, and Willow Creek had unknowingly welcomed him with open arms. Digging through public records, investigators found that Derrick had used at least 5 different names tied to fake service histories. In each case, he had applied for veteran benefits, accepted donations, or lived in veteran housing. He had never been caught in the act before, always disappearing just before his lies began to unravel. But in Willow Creek, he made a mistake. He chose the wrong person to lie to. Jason had taken his military service seriously. He knew how to spot someone who hadn't lived the life they claimed. What may have started as quiet suspicion soon grew into active investigation. Jason had likely been monitoring Derrick's movements, comparing his stories, and collecting evidence in secret. It became clear that Jason wasn't just trying to expose a liar. He was trying to protect the integrity of the veteran community he belonged to. Further evidence from Jason's laptop included a file labeled RC Fake, containing screenshots of inconsistencies in Derrick's social media posts and documents. He had even printed out enlistment verification forms and circled areas where Derrick's records didn't match. Jason was building a case, perhaps planning to turn it over to authorities or veterans advocacy groups. He was getting close, too close. Investigators also discovered that Derrick had been logging into online forums under fake profiles, posing as a soldier, and offering support to others. It was through one of these forums that he likely learned about Jason's return to Willow Creek. At some point, he must have realized Jason was onto him. That realization set everything in motion. Derrick didn't just fear being exposed, he feared losing the life he had constructed. For someone who had never earned the uniform, Jason represented everything he wasn't, and everything he could, never fake. With Jason's growing file of evidence and his refusal to back down, Derrick made a deadly decision. He had fooled many people before, but this time he faced someone who had seen war, understood truth, and couldn't be deceived. Jason had become a threat, and for Derrick, eliminating that threat meant maintaining his illusion, no matter the cost. Weeks passed without any sign of Derrick Miles. As pressure mounted and national headlines picked up the story, a tip finally came in from a hunter near the edge of the Chattahoochee National Forest. The man reported a strange smell and signs that someone had been living in an old hunting cabin off a remote trail. Deputies were dispatched to the area, and what they found confirmed their worst suspicions. Derrick had been hiding in plain sight, living off-grid just 40 miles from Willow Creek. The cabin was isolated and barely furnished. Inside, officers found canned food, water jugs, and survival gear. There was no cell service, and Derrick had clearly taken steps to avoid detection. Blackout curtains covered the windows. A camp stove and a battery-powered radio were his only connections to the outside world. But what shocked investigators most wasn't how he had been living. It was what he had taken with him. Inside a worn duffel bag, detectives found several personal items that belonged to Jason Lee. His military ID, a set of service medals, a torn photograph of Jason and Emily, and Jason's VA documents were all carefully folded and tucked inside. Also recovered was a handgun fitted with a silencer. Ballistics would later confirm it matched the bullet that killed Jason. It was a chilling sign that this murder had not been a moment of panic, but a calculated execution. Derrick was arrested at the cabin without resistance. Exhausted and underweight, he offered no explanation. At the sheriff's office, he sat silently for hours before finally admitting to the crime. But even his confession was laced with self-pity. He claimed Jason had been looking to ruin him and said he felt cornered. He offered no apology, no remorse. In his mind, Jason's attempt to expose the truth had somehow justified the murder. Investigators were struck by how coldly Derrick spoke about the killing. He said he waited near Jason's home, watched his routine, and entered the garage late at night. He knew Jason often worked there alone. When Jason arrived, Derrick was already inside. He fired one shot and fled before anyone noticed. There had been no struggle, no last words. The arrest brought a sense of relief to Willow Creek, but not closure. The community had embraced Derrick, honored him, and believed his lies. Jason had seen through them, and it cost him everything. What remained was a bitter truth, that even in a peaceful town, evil can wear a friendly face. And for a man like Jason Lee, the war didn't end on foreign soil. It followed him home. As Derrick Miles sat in a small interrogation room, awaiting the next steps in his case, the people of Willow Creek struggled to process what had unfolded. The small town, which had once celebrated Jason Lee as a hero, now felt tainted by the truth. They had been deceived by a man who had expertly woven a web of lies, and in doing so, had robbed them of a genuine hero. Emily Parker, Jason's fiancée, was still grappling with the reality of his death. She had spent months trying to hold on to the hope that Jason's paranoia had been a byproduct of his time in Afghanistan, that he would eventually heal, that he would return to being the man she had fallen in love with. But the truth was much darker. Derrick's actions had not only stolen Jason's life, but had destroyed any sense of peace she had left. The man who had caused her pain was sitting in a cell, and the man she loved was gone forever. There was no comfort in knowing the killer had been found, only an overwhelming void that nothing could fill. As the investigation moved forward, police began to uncover more disturbing details about Derrick's actions during his time in Willow Creek. He had wormed his way into veterans groups, not just to gather information about Jason, but to manipulate others. Several former soldiers, including some who had genuinely served, were interviewed. Some revealed that Derrick had made them feel uneasy long before Jason's death. They recalled small inconsistencies in his stories, moments when he seemed to know just enough about military life, but never enough to pass as a true veteran. One former soldier in particular had confided in Jason about his suspicions regarding Derrick. He had asked Jason to check out his background, but Jason had dismissed the idea, not wanting to cause any trouble. He had no idea that Derrick had already escalated his fraud to a deadly level. In hindsight, Those closest to Jason realized that he had been trying to protect them all along. He had seen through Derrick's lies, but he hadn't been able to convince anyone in time. For Emily, the most difficult part of the investigation was learning the full extent of Derrick's manipulation. He had become a fixture in the veteran community, a trusted face who, in his twisted way, had been admired. Emily struggled with how easily Derrick had woven himself into their lives. She felt betrayed, not just by Derrick, but by a community that had allowed a dangerous imposter to thrive. How could they have been so blind? Jason's funeral was small, attended only by those who had truly known him, the friends who had served beside him, the family who loved him, and the few who had seen through the lies. In the days that followed, Emily took comfort in the idea that Jason had tried to expose the truth, that his final days had been spent trying to protect others. The town would eventually heal, but it would never forget the hero who had died to reveal a darker side of their world, one where even the most trusted could be deceived, and where the cost of exposing the truth was more than anyone could have imagined. In the months following Derrick Miles's arrest, the full scope of his deception began to emerge, leaving the town of Willow Creek to grapple with the ugly truth that someone they had trusted had been living a lie for so long. Derrick's trial became a local sensation. The case, once a small-town mystery, quickly turned into a nationwide story as the details of his fraudulent military service and the chilling murder of Jason Lee captured the attention of the media. Willow Creek, once known for its tight-knit community and southern charm, was now seen as the town where a hero died at the hands of a man who had preyed on its people's goodwill and trust. For Emily, attending the trial was one of the hardest things she had ever done. Each day in the courtroom was a painful reminder of the life she had lost. Derrick's defense team tried to paint him as a man driven to desperation by a system that had failed him, claiming that he was simply trying to survive in a world that had abandoned him. But none of the excuses could justify what he had done. He was a master manipulator, someone who had preyed on the vulnerable and exploited the system for years, all while wearing a facade of goodwill. The images of Jason, his eyes always so full of life, always ready to protect others, seemed like a cruel contrast to the cold, calculating man Derrick had become. As Derrick sat in the courtroom, staring down the judge, it was clear he had no remorse. His behavior throughout the trial was detached, almost arrogant, as if he believed his actions were justified. He didn't show any sign of regret for the pain he had caused Emily, Jason's family, or the community that had unknowingly welcomed him as one of their own. His arrogance only deepened the wounds. It was as if he saw Jason's efforts to expose him as an inconvenience to his carefully constructed life, rather than the moral stand that it was. The verdict came swiftly, guilty on all charges. Derrick was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The town's sense of justice was restored, but there was no true satisfaction in the outcome. Nothing could bring Jason back. Nothing could undo the damage Derrick had caused. In the weeks that followed, Emily tried to rebuild her life, though the weight of loss never fully lifted. She began working with veteran organizations, helping those who had been affected by stolen valor and bringing awareness to the dangers of imposter soldiers. Though the pain of losing Jason would always linger, Emily found strength in knowing that his last act had been one of courage and integrity. Jason had fought for truth, even in the face of death, and Emily was determined to honor that by ensuring his story was never forgotten. Willow Creek slowly began to heal, but the scars of betrayal would remain. The town had learned a hard lesson, that even the most trusted can harbor dark secrets, and sometimes the cost of uncovering those secrets is higher than anyone can anticipate. But in the end, Jason Lee's name was remembered not just for his tragic death, but for the bravery he displayed in exposing the lies that had taken root in his own backyard.